This short video goes over a simple idea I've had. It's something that's been brewing in my mind ever since I started to incorporate these specks of bronze into my pots. The idea itself was reinforced after I unpacked these two bowls from my kiln. In fact, the two bowls you're about to see might be my favourite pots that I've made all year. Each was thrown from ES80, a high iron stoneware body, and each contained bronze particles that were mixed randomly into the lumps of clay prior to throwing. This means I have absolutely no idea where the red spots will appear afterwards. Bronze, by the way, is made up from about 88% copper, the remaining percent usually being a combination of tin and zinc. And it's the copper therein that creates the red dots that I'm talking about. And it was the larger, white bowl of the pair that did something that I just loved. And it's the simple fact that the two bronze dots lined up, one on the exterior, another on the interior. It makes what are normally just arbitrary specks feel far more intentional, as if the pot was purposefully made to look like this. And again, it gives the pot direction, a face. It almost becomes a simple decorative motif, in a similar way, I suppose, to my lined vessels. This is about as much decoration as I'll do, as the last thing I want is for my pots to lose that minimal edge they've got. But small marks like this, be it the lines or the dots, are enough to give the pots direction, or rather, an obvious way to display them and look at them. Such as with this pair, which again, weren't made to match, but after unpacking them from the kiln, it's as if they were made to be together. And then there are the pots where the red dots really do appear randomly. I don't mind these, but I think the vessels lose some of the intention and simplistic elements many of my other works have. And so in this video, I'm going to go over this idea. I'm going to trim a set of bowls similar to these, made with clay that doesn't contain any bronze. And then, once turned, I'll implant two small specks of bronze into each piece to hopefully recreate how this looks. I know by lining them up like this, the pieces do to some degree lose some spontaneous quality, but if it means they're given something else, something extra, a way of extending my design and ideals through small chunks of metal, then I think that's a good thing to pursue. These are the bits of bronze I'm going to be using. They were sent to me by Alex Pole, a blacksmith, and were scraps, offcuts from his process, so it's a nice way to reuse something that would have otherwise potentially been thrown away, and combines ceramics and metalwork in a way that I really like. The pieces themselves are minuscule, and they're also really brittle, so they break and flake into even smaller pieces, which means even when I'm throwing with this stuff mixed into the clay, I can barely feel it. And I suppose the good thing about adding this stuff to the pots after they've been trimmed is that the bronze no longer contaminates my clay in reclaim. Which is a good thing, as one batch of my recycled clay was really oversaturated with bronze, which led to a batch of very speckly red pots. These are the bowls I'll be trimming, and I check whether the clay is in the right condition to trim by feeling and trying to smudge the underside. If I drag my finger over these wiring off marks, and they easily smear, then the clay is likely too soft to trim. Just like you can see here with this piece on the left. It also feels slightly more cold and it sticks to my finger, whereas the pot on the right feels much drier and is warmer too. This one is ready to be trimmed, whereas the pot on the left still needs about an hour or so left upturned like this in order to dry out properly. In fact, how dry my pots are for trimming is really important, as clay on the soft side of leather hard can easily deform with a small amount of pressure from the tool pressing against it, whereas when it's on the slightly more firm side of leather hard, the pot holds its shape better, which is crucial for me with the amount of trimming I do. Sometimes, as throwing pots dry overnight, any slight irregularity in them can be exaggerated, as the walls twist and unwind. So, to get rid of the worst of this, I upturn the pot and then trim the base flat, getting rid of the slight undulation in the bottom caused by the wobbly rim. This way, when the bowl is turned back the right way up, the unevenness in the lip shouldn't be so severe. Yet doing this doesn't always correct it fully. Sometimes it fixes it entirely, and sometimes it just makes it a touch more manageable. The pot is then placed onto a bed of slip and tap-centered. I then seal the bottom with a rubber kidney, pressing some of the excess clay in the base into the metal wheel head. The first thing I do is just refine the interior curve these bowls have, both with a metal and plastic kidney, and then I'm just going to soften the rim slightly by beveling it to a sharper edge. This will give the overall impression that the pot is thinner than it actually is, and creates a shape that's more comfortable to use if you were to drink from this vessel. And lastly, I burnish it with a plastic kidney, shoving any coarse specks of grog back into the clay body, so they aren't quite so present on the rim. Next, as the pot is still attached the right way up, I'm going to trim the upper section of the bowl. These pots are thrown relatively thick, with a touch of excess clay in the walls and base, and they're also made with a lovely round interior. This means that at the leather hard stage, I can trim them to have an angular exterior, as there's ample clay for me to work with, whilst retaining the much more functional curved shape on the inside. With the top section of the bowl trimmed mostly flat, I can slice the pot off the wheel, tidy up the wheel head, and then flip it upside down. The wheel head is cleaned, so no burrs of clay stick back into the rim of the bowl. It's tap-centered, which is a technique I recently made a much longer video about, a link to which I'll leave on screen now and in the description below. A spinner is then placed on top, tap-centered, and through this I'll be able to pin the pot down firmly in place as I continue trimming the rim and making it straighter. It's easier to see the shape now the pot has been turned upside down, but the reason I begin trimming this part when the pot's the other way round is so that I can feel the cross-section of this area, which informs me of exactly how much clay I can remove, especially once it's flipped upside down and I can no longer feel it. And it's now that I pin the pot in place with 3 lumps of soft clay. This keeps it held snugly in the middle, but I'm careful not to press these lugs of clay too firmly against the actual pot, as the rim of the bowl is quite easy to distort. I then measure 5.6 centimeters. This will be the width of my foot, and I'm using a new pair of calipers to do this, which are actually some nautical dividers I found recently in an antique shop. They can be fastened incredibly tightly, but what I like most is how sharp the tips are, as it means I can use them to simply score a line into the bottom to designate the width of the foot I'll be trimming. Meaning there's one less tool I have to use when doing this, as previously I would have used both a pair of calipers and a sharp potter's needle. The next step is to define this lower section into 2 distinct planes. There's the vertical foot, and there'll be another sloping portion to the bowl, and I find using the corner of the tool works best for this initially, as it easily cleaves away the clay. In fact, whenever I use my tungsten carbide tools, I often use only a small portion of the blade, if my intent is to actually remove quite a lot of mass, as these very sharp blades do have a tendency to chatter and bounce on the surface if too much of the length is used, and if the clay is trimmed when it's perhaps too soft or too hard. But generally speaking, I would say these tools work far worse on soft clay, as the blade will just sink into the damp stoneware, gouging away at it easily. I think I uncovered a small bit of plaster in the wall, which will cause lime popping later on, so I dig it out and then fill it up with some more clay, and then continue trimming it flush. The other annoying thing about trimming pots that contain those particles of bronze is that they'd often be torn out by the blade and dragged across the pot's surface, leaving these long scratches, which I'd then have to spend time filling up and trimming over. In fact, I've been trimming so much clay with metal inclusions in lately that I'd forgotten how nice it is to trim smoother clay. With the outer angular walls now set, I can begin work on the base. I begin by trimming the outermost portion flat, and then I trim a very slight beveled edge around the outside. I can then start on what's perhaps the hardest part of this process, which is hollowing out this deep foot. As the base of this pot is so thick, the clay inside is always going to be slightly softer. This means, as you get deeper, you have to adjust the way you trim, as the stoneware will begin sticking to the blade more and more. And as the cross-section itself becomes thinner and the clay becomes softer, you need to be really attentive to how thick the base is, and you need to have a lot of control with the blade. I tend to begin by defining the outermost point of the foot. This way, when I trim from the centre towards the outside, there's a clear boundary, so I know exactly where to stop. My main concern at the start is simply digging down. I don't worry about the internal wall being neat or anything. I just want to gouge away as much clay as I can from this part of the pot, otherwise the vessel would be very bottom heavy. And like mentioned earlier, as I get down deeper, the clay becomes stickier, which means I occasionally have to reach inside and fish those sticky ribbons of stoneware out. In this case, when trimming the foot, I was able to turn the interior portion of the footwell deeper than the walls on the outside. This is normally a good indicator that more clay can be removed from the outside shape, the foot portion itself becoming taller, which is a good thing in my opinion, as I'm a sucker for tall feet. Ideally, from a visual standpoint, you want the wall here, where the blade is, to more or less be the same level as the floor of the footwell inside the foot ring. And if either two are off, it means there's a slight discrepancy in the trimming, and it's something I always find myself looking for when handling work made by others. I then burnish the very top of the foot ring to make the clay glassy smooth, and then I stamp it with my maker's mark whilst pinching it from either side. This stops the material from splaying out too much as the indentation is made. And now, at long last, we can get to the point where the bronze is inserted, as that's really the whole simple idea behind this video. I place the pot back the right way up on one of these high pressure laminate bats, which have a really smooth surface. This way nothing's imprinted into the foot ring itself, as wooden bats and wearboards can do this. I then place a chopstick on top, spanning the sides across the centre. You could use anything to do this, but I went with a chopstick as it's rounded, light, and has less of a chance of indenting the rim. I then make a small pinprick just below the guide on the inside of the bowl and then on the outside. I'm not necessarily going to be inserting the bronze into these, they merely indicate where the bronze has to go. I then wet a finger and press a piece of bronze onto it. The metal sticks to it and helps it stand on end. This will make it easier to insert into the stoneware. I then brace the wall from the outside and try my best to jam the piece of bronze into the clay. It doesn't have to go all the way in initially, it just has to be lightly tacked in place. I then take a tungsten tip tool that's intended for carving stone and use it to delicately push the piece of bronze into the clay, like so. This is all tremendously fiddly work, and the bronze in many cases kept fracturing as I pressed it in, flush. Then, to insert the speck on the outer portion, I flip the pot upside down. This way the rim stays lovely and round and sort of braces itself as the metal is inserted into it. These chunks of bronze are going to blossom into larger specks anyway, so the orientation they're pressed into the stoneware doesn't really matter, as long as they're pressed in firmly enough so they won't fall out. But the most important thing for this idea is that they're properly lined up, one on the inside of the lip, the other on the outside. And here it is for now. Sadly, you won't see the finished thing in this video. Really, this video is just a way of me documenting an idea I've had and want to explore, and I can't wait to see how this group of bowls looks once fired. The videos on my channel have always been made to be adjacent to what my actual craft practice is. What I mean by that is that sometimes the videos will be really simple, like this. I don't always have the time, footage, or energy to produce longer content that shows the craft from beginning to end. Sometimes it's just like a short little diary entry about a process, step, or idea that really excites me. And these tiny red dots really are exciting. Despite how small and subtle they are, they allow me to intentionally make a small amount of surface decoration, which I'm thankful for, as otherwise my vessels tend to be so uniform and samey from piece to piece. Somebody sent me a funny email stating how they think the red dots resemble the fact that the pots have already sold, before they've even been photographed and put on the website. I hope that this doesn't cause a split on the rim. That's the only thing I could see happening. As the metal is inserted into it, I've got to be careful not to do this when the clay is too hard, which is why I do it bowl by bowl. But if this works and I really like it, and I do it on a much larger batch, say with about 50 to 100 bowls, I think I'd be inclined to first trim a board of bowls, and then insert all the specks of bronze into say 10 or so, before trimming the next 10, and then inserting the metal, and so on, as doing it after each piece does interrupt the process quite a lot. Either way, this is one of many ideas I want to pursue next year, in part to make my work feel more individual and recognisable, perhaps. Not every single pot I make will get red dots like this, but in terms of creating work for exhibitions or to be displayed, it's a really exciting prospect. And it also opens the doors for lots of other metals being used. But what I really like about the copper is it doesn't dribble or run too much within the glaze. Instead it creates this lovely little round dot, an orb of warmth on otherwise very cold glazes. Anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to watch. And if you are taking time off over the holidays, I wish you a very Merry Christmas. And, like always, I'll see you next time.